The winter wind screamed over the chalk cliffs of northern France. From a distance, the site looked like nothing more than a wound in the earth, a maze of scaffolding, cranes, and men working under floodlights that never went dark. Trucks rumbled in day and night, their engines echoing through the valley, but few knew what was really being built here. The locals whispered it was an underground factory. Others said it was a new bunker for Hitler himself. Only a handful of engineers and one ruthless colonel knew the truth. Inside the damp tunnels, Colonel August Mettel stood over a blueprint that stretched across an entire table. Pencil marks, measurements, and coded notations ran like veins across the page. His gloved finger traced a single line, a line so long it extended off the edge of the paper. "That," he said quietly to the young engineer beside him, "is the barrel, 124 meters long. When finished, it will send a shell to London in under 2 minutes." The engineer swallowed. "Sir, that distance is impossible." Mettel turned. "Impossible?" His voice was calm but sharp. "That's what they said about the V1. That's what they said about the V2, and yet both struck England." He leaned closer, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Now it's our turn. The V3 will end this war." The project's official codename was Hochdruckpumpe, high-pressure pump, but among the workers it had another name, Der Tausendfüßler, the millipede, because deep beneath their feet, buried into the rock, lay 5 colossal barrels, each one slanted upward at a 45-degree angle aimed directly at London, 165 kilometers away. Dozens of smaller combustion chambers lined the sides, designed to ignite sequentially, each explosion accelerating the projectile faster and faster down the tube. It wasn't a cannon, it was a supergun, the longest ever conceived by man. Far above, Allied pilots flew nightly reconnaissance missions. Photographs taken from 30,000 feet showed strange patterns in the earth, long trenches, railway lines, mounds of chalk. Analysts at RAF Medmenham puzzled over the images. Some thought it was another V2 site, others believed it was a decoy. But one man, an intelligence officer named Duncan Forrester, wasn't convinced. He studied the angle of the excavations, the placement of the support tunnels, and the repeated reinforcement markings. They're building something to fire, something massive. His report went to London that night, directly to Churchill's desk. The Prime Minister read it in silence, a cigar smoldering between his fingers. Another weapon, another nightmare. The V1 buzz bombs had already scarred the skies, and the V2 rockets had fallen without warning. Now this? He scribbled a single note in the margin. Find it, destroy it.
Back in Monacoque, France, the work continued day and night. Slave laborers from Poland and France toiled under SS guards, digging through rock with pneumatic drills, choking on dust, and sleeping in the same tunnels they built. The deeper they dug, the hotter the air became. The deeper they went, the more it felt like descending into hell. Somewhere in the darkness, a young worker whispered, "This thing will never fire, it's cursed." But the engineers pressed on. Steel frames were lowered into place. Rail systems built to deliver the shells, each over 3 meters long, were installed. The first firing test was scheduled for early 1944. As Colonel Medal walked through the echoing chambers, he imagined it already. The thunder of the gun, the distant destruction of London, Hitler's triumphant broadcast. He didn't know it yet, but the very thing that made the weapon powerful, its size, would also be its doom. Because, above the clouds, British bombers were already en route. The moon hid behind cloud as the first whisper of steel came over the channel. In London, Duncan Forrester's photograph had not been the only alarm bell. A stream of reports, Testimonies from escaped laborers and intercepted radio traffic built a mosaic of certainty. The Allies had a new secret, something enormous and deliberate under the chalk of northern France, aimed like a finger at the heart of Britain. Churchill's note had been short, but its consequences were enormous. Operation Crossbow, the campaign against Germany's vengeance weapons, intensified overnight. Reconnaissance flights multiplied. Bomber crews practiced low, precise approaches. Intelligence officers argued over angles and yield and whether the weapon could even reach the smoke. Engineers in London sketched trajectories, trying to understand how a 3-meter projectile could be accelerated beyond any conventional gun. Back in Mimoix, France, the rhythm below ground had not slowed. Men hammered, riveted, wheeled. The millipedes' long barrels were bolted together inside tunnels, each seam a small, terrifying promise. They measured distance in degrees and kilometers, and in long lists of materials: powdered propellants, firing chambers, pumps, steel liners. Workers sweated and coughed and still hammered. They'd been told what their work represented: a final victory. They had been told nothing of what their lives would cost. Allied intelligence now had a clearer picture: parallel galleries, 5 sloped tubes, ammunition stores carved into the cliff, and massive reinforced bunkers meant to hide and protect. If it fired even a handful of rounds, the shell would have the potential to fall somewhere in Greater London. The implications were chilling. A plan formed in a dim room at RAF Bomber Command. The V-3 could not be treated as just another target. It could not be blasted like a factory and left. It had to be disabled beneath the earth. Conventional bombing had failed against underground complexes before. The V-2 sites had almost been impossible to destroy with general raids. What was needed was precision, an enormous bomb that could punch through rock. The answer came in a single name: Tallboy. Designed by Barnes Wallis, the 12,000-pound earthquake bomb was built to burrow and detonate deep beneath hardened structures, to collapse them from the inside out. It was a new kind of weapon for a new kind of problem. But the Tallboy required a rare breed of bomber and a rare breed of crew. It needed a near vertical fall and absolute accuracy. It needed men who could fly clean and true through flak and weather and return. 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, had already proven they could do the impossible. They trained again, this time to carry Tallboys to the French coast, to descend through cloud and flak, and to deliver a single blow with surgical precision. On a cold night in July 1944, the squadrons took off. They flew in low, hugging the English coastline until the channel became a ribbon of black. Navigators checked and double-checked. Bomb sites were set. Crews whispered prayers.
Below at Mimoix, some engineers spoke of rumors of attack, but most had learned to ignore them. Their guards had orders to keep watch, but the whole complex was designed to be hidden as a quarry, a railway, a workshop. Now the quarry's false face would be stripped away by the sky. The first Tallboy struck at dawn. It hit the hillside like a meteor, burying itself in chalk and detonating far beneath the surface. The earth groaned. Tunnels that had taken months to carve shuddered and flexed. Men in nearby galleries were thrown to the ground by the blast wave. Dust cascaded like an avalanche. The millipede shuddered, its barrel seams jarred. But it did not fall. The first hit cracked concrete, collapsed a service tunnel, and sent a plume of chalk high into the sky, visible for miles. For the German command, it was a wake-up call. For the Allies, it was confirmation. The supergun could be reached. Bomber crews returned again and again, each sortie a careful choreography of speed and altitude. Each Tallboy was a scalpel. Each impact punched into layers of chalk and reinforced concrete. The site's camouflage became a chaos of rubble. Reinforcements were called in. The SS attempted hurried repairs with a grim economy of men and materials. They sent more laborers down into tunnels to shore up galleries, to wedge timbers under cracked beams, to haul away rubble in the dim light. The human cost rose. Prisoners collapsed from exhaustion in the passageways. Some never rose again. The muffled screams of those trapped underfalls occasionally broke through to the surface when the ground shifted and vented. The millipedes builders, so certain of success, watched their machine writhe under the hand of distant enemies. On the 7th raid, one tall boy found its aim not at the tunnel's entrance, but at a specially reinforced gallery. It penetrated 100 feet of chalk and concrete and detonated in a cavern full of equipment and stockpiled propellant. The instant blast sheared supports, twisted rails, and collapsed a vast chamber. Buried in the devastation was much of the V3's firing apparatus, mangled beyond immediate repair. A warehouse filled with prepped projectiles was buried, its shells locked in a tomb of rock. Yet the weapon was not simply a single point to destroy. The Germans had designed redundancy into the project. If one gallery fell, others could be repaired, albeit with time. More terrifying was the possibility that a repaired site, even if damaged, could still fire with reduced effect. The Allies needed certainty. They needed the site neutralized permanently. Intelligence fed Churchill data, trajectories, possible fall zones in London, estimated firing cycles and reload times. Panic in the British cabinet flared briefly. The idea of an enemy that could lob shells into the metropolis on a timetable gnawed at the decision-makers. Yet, the more they learned, the more they realized the vulnerability of the MIMEX concept. Its very genius, the super long barrel and the network of side charges, required massive concrete structures, long railways and open quarries visible from the air. To protect one, you had to protect all, and the Allies had air supremacy and focus. Meanwhile, the Germans pressed on, frantic and supremely stubborn. Colonel Medel rode from gallery to gallery, his uniform smeared with dust and oil, barking orders in clipped tones. Patch this, reinforce that, move the stockpile. He refused to accept failure. In his mind, the V3 represented final proof of German science and will. He brought in new teams, new engineers, and announced a scaling back of visible works to make the site less conspicuous. But for every repair, the RAF returned. The tall boys, when they struck, ripped out the mountain in ways no quick repair could heal. Each mission shaved away at the tunnel network like a slow but relentless saw.
Beneath the chalk and rubble, human stories accumulated like rings in a felled tree. A young engineer, Tomas, who had been drafted from occupied Poland, scribbled in a torn notebook between shifts. He wrote about the sound of the bombs as a different kind of thunder from his childhood. He wrote of a named child he'd never meet, and of the pitiless cadence of orders. After one raid, a shell fell through a shaft and crushed the bunk where he slept. He survived by a trench of overturned equipment, but his hands were scarred. Another man, a French laborer named Marcel, dug a tunnel so that an air vent could be rerouted. He later died by collapse, trying to rescue a trapped comrade. The Allies were aware of these human costs, but their calculus remained grim and simple. Destroy the weapon, save London. The moral complexity pressed at commanders' hearts, but the strategy did not change. One night, in late summer, the most decisive mission came. It was a carefully planned, brave, and dangerous effort. The squadrons flew deep into storms and anti-aircraft zones, each tall boy a single bullet in the hand of fate. Navigation found the quarry, bombs released, the hillside took the blows, and did not give easily. But this time, the bombs hit in precisely the right pattern. The ground opened. Caverns that had been the millipedes' lungs collapsed. Massive rooms full of pipework, pumps, and the firing charge complex were buried under tons of chalk. The galleries that had once held the barrel's butt were crushed inward. Rails kinked and snapped. Concrete ribs broke and fell like broken teeth. When dawn broke over the valley, the Mimoyex site looked like a wound gone through a second surgery, blackened, torn, and smoking. Men on the ground watched with a mixture of wonder and dread. The supergun's backbone was broken. Colonel Medal walked among the rubble, dust covering his shoes. He looked at the shattered entries and the upward gash in the hill and finally understood what the engineers across the channel had known all along. The V3 was not invincible. It needed space and support and time, and the Allies were taking all three away. He ordered the remaining men to seal certain tunnels, to clear what could be cleared, and to prepare a propaganda line that the site had not been intended for immediate use. History would later judge such orders in many ways, but in the moment, they were a thin attempt to mask failure with words. In London, the relief was tangible and immediate. The immediate threat, a steady rain of 150-kilogram shells into the city, was receding. The V3 project, while not wholly dead, had been pushed off the list of urgent fears. Churchill's staff relaxed a touch. Parisians and Londoners could sleep without a new kind of thunder in the sky. But there was an aftertaste. The V3's near success had shown how close technology could bring devastation. The danger was real enough to force mass planning, mass expenditure, and mass bombing. The Allies had been forced to invent new tactics, tall boys, precision strikes, squadron reorganization, just to stop one idea. And yet, the story of Mimoyeks was not only a story of bombs and engineering. It was about people. The engineers convinced to believe, the forced laborers who died under the weight of others' ambitions, the bomber crews who risked everything to hit a narrow target, and the intelligence officers who pieced together shadow and rumor into action. Each of these threads braided together into a single event that for a time held London's fate in suspense. As the site settled into a new, quieter ruin, small teams of sappers and engineers still crawled through the remains, dragging out bent metal and counting the cost. The V3's dream lay mangled in chalk and concrete. The Millipede's dream of reaching London had been buried in the very earth it tried to command. But even buried, the idea would endure, a reminder that in war, the next secret weapon is always only one clever plan away. The Allies had stopped the V3, but the price had been high in men, missions, and fear. The lesson, write it down, teach it, and never forget it, would travel through post-war doctrine, into books, into lectures, and into the scars left on the White Cliffs.
They called the tunnels Mimoyeks, but for the men who lived there, it might as well have been called night. Day and night blurred into a single stretch of work, hammering, coughing, and cold. The light that reached the galleries came from bare bulbs swinging on chains, throwing people's faces into carved masks of shadow. The chalk dust coated everything, skin, lungs, tongues. You could rub it from a boot and it would show the map of a life spent underground. Tomasz, the Polish engineer, kept his notebook hidden under his shirt. He wrote when he could, in stolen moments between shifts, in the dark where the guards could not see. He wrote of the barrel, of the clever rows of side chambers that would light in sequence and push a projectile forward, each explosion adding velocity like pistons in a long, terrible engine. He drew diagrams, crude and beautiful, of the spiraled rails and the way the shells would be cradled on rollers, hurled along a straight, impossible road toward London. Marcel, the French laborer, carried his grief on his back as if it were extra ballast. He had been dragged from his village with dozens of others. The SS had promised work. What he found was the work of nations, moving tons of stone for a weapon none of them had asked for. He tried to shout once, to refuse, and a guard had cracked him with a boot. After that, he moved with his head down and his hands raw. They told themselves small lies to keep going. This tunnel is temporary. This job will end. Someone will come for us. But the tunnels had a way of swallowing promises. Men died here in quiet ways, crushed under a collapsed ceiling, suffocated by dust, beaten into silence. Bodies were carried out in burlap sacks and replaced by others from morning transports. Names vanished with each new arrival. Not all the workers were prisoners. Some were German specialists who came willingly, engineers and machinists who believed in the science, in the prestige. They argued in broken French and German over tolerances and pressures.
if the side charges fire in precise microsecond synchronization, one of them explained late one night to a young technician. The projectile's acceleration curve will be smooth enough to avoid structural failure. The technician nodded, but his eyes were frightened. He had never seen a barrel so long. He had never worked on a weapon whose logic reached for another country. The V3's design read like an answer to a math problem. The barrels were long because the Germans thought longer meant faster, and faster meant range. But you cannot simply stretch a steel tube and call it a cannon. The shell had to be coaxed like a wild animal. The designers broke the tube into repeatable sections, each with its auxiliary chamber, a small angled space where an explosive charge would detonate milliseconds after the one before it, adding velocity without giving the shell a single intolerable shock. In paper diagrams, it looked elegant, even inevitable. In reality, each chamber had to be timed, aligned, and sealed. Each seam was a potential failure point. A single misfire could tear a joint apart. A misaligned plate could shatter the projectile. The propellant had to be exactly the right composition. Too hot and the barrel would buckle. Too soggy and a round would fizzle. The projectiles themselves were monstrous, heavy, finely machined, and expensive. Each would have cost a fortune in materials and time. Allied analysts pored over captured schematics and walk-around intelligence. They learned the V3 was less a single supercannon and more a system. Rails to cradle the shell, rollers to move it forward for each successive impulse, elaborate ignition lines running down the side, and thick ribs of reinforced concrete to hold back the forces. They also learned about the cooling problems. A continuous firing cycle would heat steel to the point of warping. The designers had planned for water cooling and service breaks, but service meant time, and time was a luxury the Germans seldom had in 1944.
Intelligence was a living thing in London. Forrester and his cell sifted through reports from agents, from resistance fighters in Pas-de-Calais, from escaped laborers who kept their gossip alive in cramped cafes. A word here, a sketch there. One informant spoke of a railway spur that led not to a factory, but into the cliff itself. Another mentioned drill rigs and fresh rail lines. When the RAF photographs came back, long pale lines carved in chalk, the picture hardened into reality. The men who planned the Tallboy raids understood the moral weight of what they would do. They would be bombing the same landscape that buried thousands of workers, many of them forced laborers. They would be setting concrete upon concrete, smashing a machine that men had died to build. But in their calculus, the lives in London counted against the lives in the quarry. The decision was cold but definitive. Stop the V3 or accept the destruction of a capital. In the workshops beneath the cliffs, there were other stories. A machinist named Helmut, who had enlisted as a young man out of pride, regretted sometimes the sharpness of the tools he wielded. He had designed rifling lines and fitted rollers and then watched a shell carriage be lowered into place. He told a friend once that he sometimes stood at the gallery rim at night and listened to the distant hum of London, faint as a hymn. He wondered who would hear that hymn again if his work succeeded. He was a man caught between duty and doubt. Beyond the men who built and died, there were the engineers who designed countermeasures. The British experimented with interception techniques, with networks of barrage balloons, with new radar placements and ordnance. They considered, briefly and darkly, how to evacuate or harden parts of London, how to distribute the key industries so a single strike could not paralyze the city. None of those ideas were pleasant. All of them were necessary. The Ministry of Home Security drew up contingency plans for rebel clearing brigades, for massed first aid, for the quick reopening of vital arteries. The V3 had forced multiplied fear into plans. Yet despite the intelligence and the bombing, the German command tried to salvage their work. Engineers patched galleries, poured fresh concrete, and rewired ignition leads. They worked by the rhythm of warnings, by the sound of planes, by the cadence of fear. If one chamber was damaged, they would attempt to isolate it and fire the rest with adjusted timing.
The idea was resilient. The machine's logic allowed for local failure and still promised some result. And then there were the seeding operations, a network of saboteurs and spies who had infiltrated peripheral industries. Some of these agents quietly smeared the propellant mixtures with humidity, others introduced slight deviations in the timing triggers. Sabotage at scale is a slow art. A pulse here, a corrosion there. The Allies used it where they could, but it was fragile, and the Germans grew suspicious fast. The SS tightened the drill, the watchful eye becoming ever closer. 2 weeks after the heaviest tallboy assault, a small, muffled explosion sang down one of the Mimoyek's galleries. Men ran to the scene and found a ruined ignition manifold, a simple component, but one that forced a weeks-long halt. It was the kind of small failure that never made headlines, but could, in aggregate, end an entire program. The engineers cursed and reordered parts. Spare components were hard to bring in. Truck convoys were harried by Allied aircraft. Supplies slowed. Inside the tunnels, morale ebbed and flowed. On a bright morning after a rain, the sun seemed impossibly honest when it touched concrete ruins. Men who had survived huddled together, counting breaths and matches and small portions of bread. They whispered about the world above, about whether the millipede was a dream that could be killed. They argued over who had seen what in the last strike, whether the tallboy had truly collapsed a main gallery, whether the firing chamber would ever be usable again. Each whispered version of the truth bent toward hope, because hope kept hands moving.
In London, analysts modeled trajectories again and again. They calculated where shells might land if a half-functioning V3 were to fire with reduced velocity. They mapped hospitals, bridges, schools. They rehearsed the odd nightmare that multiple shells might land in quick succession, and planners' charts filled with shaded danger zones. They briefed ministers. They briefed Churchill. The city's nerves were taut, the populace tired of new threats. Each new intelligence bulletin exhausted citizens a little more. And still the Germans dug, and patched, and planned. War is not a single event, but a sequence of stubborn attempts, and Mimio-X was stubborn to the end. For Colonel Medell, the site was a monument to human will, and yet even he could see the cracks. His officers spoke in lower tones when the tall boys hit. They apologized to each other for things that did not need apology, for wasted lives, for miscalculated schedules, for the hubris of building a gun that reached beyond reason. In the end, technology met logistics and human resistance in the simplest way. The shell could not be made to fly without a protected, functioning system, and the Allies, through air power, intelligence, and sometimes courage on the ground, denied that system the space and time it needed. As the summer wore on and the raids took their toll, the Mimio-X site transitioned from a hive of creation into a field of ruins. Machines rusted, rails warped under frost and bomb shock. The galleries that had once hummed with activity lay silent, the occasional groan of settling chalk the only sound. Men lingered, some because they had nowhere else to go, others because the orders did not reach them. For the prisoners, release came slow and confused. For the specialists, reassignment or court inquiry awaited. Tomas's notebook ended with a single line. We built a gun for a dream that fired at the future, but struck only our present. He enclosed the page in oilcloth and hid it inside a metal casing he hoped would survive the next blast. Marcel never finished another sentence. He died under a collapse, unnamed in the official record. Helmets survived the war, and later, in a small town, he told his grandchildren that men sometimes make machines for reasons they barely understand. The millipede would be remembered in many ways: engineering audacity, brutality, near-miss calamity. For those who survived, it was a lesson in the scale of human projects, how quickly they could become monstrous, and how the smallest decisions in distant rooms could cost thousands of breaths. The submarine shuddered again, a deep, angry vibration that rattled through every bolt and bone. Dust and rust fell from the ceiling as another depth charge exploded somewhere above. The pressure wave slammed into the hull like a hammer,
Men flinched instinctively, gripping pipes and handles. The metallic groan of the U-boat felt like the scream of a wounded beast. Inside the radio compartment, sparks spat from the broken transmitter. Radio operator Mueller banged the side of the unit, but it was hopeless. The circuits were fried. He could hear the faint static of the ocean pressing in from all sides, the sound of the deep swallowing their signal. Nothing. Not a single line getting through. In the command room, Karl Voss stood still, staring at the red emergency light that flickered like a dying heartbeat. His eyes were hollow, but focused. They'll find us. They always do. Captain? Hans asked quietly, his face pale and drenched with sweat. Karl didn't answer immediately. He turned to face the crew. Men, he said finally, his voice low but steady. We've done everything we can. The pumps are failing, the oxygen's running out, and the engines are gone. But we're still alive. That means we fight to stay that way.
Someone coughed, a deep, wet cough that echoed down the narrow hallway. The air was thick, sour with carbon dioxide. Every breath burned. In the engine room, mechanic Otto Becker knelt beside the main motor housing. He'd stripped the casing open, his hands black with oil and blood. A gear had cracked during the last blast, and now it refused to engage. He whispered to himself, half prayer, half curse. Come on, you bastard." The overhead pipes hissed. A drop of water splashed onto his neck. Seawater. Cold. Real. It was leaking from the upper seam. He shouted, "Captain, we've got water coming through the aft." Karl moved fast, ducking under cables and crawling through the narrow passage until he reached the rear compartment. The leak wasn't huge yet, but it was enough. He watched the trickle slide down the bulkhead. "Seal it with whatever you've got," he barked. Otto grabbed a roll of rubber tape and cloth, pressing it into the gap, his hands trembling. 2 men joined him, using wrenches and scrap metal to brace it. The sound of rushing water stopped for a moment, then resumed, slower but steady. They all knew it wouldn't hold forever. Hours dragged by. The crew fell into a trance of exhaustion, some praying softly, others staring at nothing. One man, barely 20, whispered to himself over and over, "I'll see the sky again. I'll see the sky again." At the navigation table, Karl studied the chart under the dim light. They had drifted west, dangerously close to the British convoy lanes. The irony stung. They had hunted those same ships weeks ago, and now they were the hunted. Hans approached quietly. "Captain," he said, "I've been thinking, if we surface at night, maybe, just maybe, we can send an SOS. Say we surrender. They'll pick us up." Karl looked at him sharply. "And you think the Allies will risk their ships for us? They'll destroy us the moment they see this hull." Hans hesitated, then whispered, "Better that than dying in the dark." The captain's jaw tightened. He didn't reply. Instead, he looked at the men. Gaunt faces, trembling hands, eyes red from fumes and fear. He couldn't let them die hopeless. He said, "We wait until dusk. If we're not dead by then, we surface." They waited. Time had no meaning, only the rhythmic sound of their slow death. The air grew heavier. Lights dimmed as batteries drained. One by one, men collapsed, too weak to stand. Otto was the first to faint. 2 others followed. "Captain," Hans said hoarsely, "oxygen's critical. We have to act now." Karl finally nodded. "Prepare to surface." The words sent a ripple through the men. They moved sluggishly but with purpose. Valves creaked, levers clanged, compressed air hissed into the ballast tanks, forcing the water out. The submarine groaned as it began to rise. The depth gauge needle ticked upward. 180, 150, 100. Then, boom! A thunderous explosion rocked the hull. One of the ballast tanks had ruptured. The submarine lurched sideways, throwing men against walls. Pipes burst, spraying water. Karl shouted, "Hold her steady!" Hans wrestled with the controls, his arms shaking. "We're losing pressure. I can't..."
Keep going, Carl roared. The depth gauge jumped erratically. 80, 60, 45. Then, light.
A faint, silvery shimmer through the periscope lens. The surface. "Surface achieved!" shouted Hans, voice breaking. Carl didn't wait. He climbed the ladder, pushed open the hatch, and the ocean air hit him like salvation. Cold, real, the wind howled across the sea. The storm had calmed, but waves still rose like dark mountains. He pulled himself out, eyes scanning the endless horizon. For a moment, there was only silence, just the vast, merciless Atlantic. Then he saw it, a distant shadow, low and sleek on the water. A destroyer. He froze. Down below, Hans yelled, "What do you see, Captain?" Carl hesitated. He could lie, give them hope, but he didn't. "British," he said. "Bearing north." The crew below went quiet. Every man knew what that meant. "Orders?" Hans asked. Carl looked at the sky, the clouds glowing faintly with dawn, and exhaled slowly. "Signal surrender." The words felt heavier than any command he had ever given. Hans stared. "You can't mean—" "I mean it," Carl cut him off. "No more death. Not for this." He climbed down again, eyes meeting every man's as he spoke. "Gentlemen, we did our duty. But the sea doesn't care who wins wars. It only remembers who lives and who dies. Today, we live." They raised a white cloth through the hatch. The destroyer's searchlight blinked once. Then again. The Morse pattern. Understood. The British ship approached slowly. As the first sunlight touched the sea, U-boat 327 floated silently on the waves, battered, bleeding, but alive. And inside, men who'd faced the darkness together breathed their first full breath in 3 days. It tasted like freedom.
The destroyer loomed larger by the minute, its gray silhouette slicing through the waves, its guns pointed straight at the broken U-boat. The crew inside stood frozen, watching through the open hatch. For 72 hours, they had fought the ocean, the machines, and their own fear. Now the war they'd tried to escape had finally found them again. Captain Carl Voss gripped the ladder rail, the icy wind burning his face. He kept his eyes fixed on the approaching vessel. Around him, the men whispered prayers, some clutching photos, others just staring into the dark water below. A voice echoed from a megaphone across the waves, British, sharp, commanding. "This is HMS Hunter. Identify yourself. Stand down and do not attempt to dive, or you will be fired upon." Carl climbed fully out of the hatch, raising both hands. The white cloth fluttered from the periscope like a ghost's flag. He shouted back, "U-327, we surrender. No power, no weapons, survivors only." For a long moment there was silence, except for the crash of the sea. Then the destroyer slowed. Searchlights washed over the submarine, blinding bright beams cutting through mist and spray. Inside the U-boat, the men shielded their eyes, trembling. One muttered, "They're going to fire. They'll kill us anyway." "No," Carl said firmly. "They won't." And for the first time in 3 days, he believed his own words. The destroyer's engines rumbled closer. Ropes were thrown. British sailors, armed but cautious, boarded the U-boat. Their boots clanged on the metal deck. One officer, young and weary-eyed, looked at Carl. "You're the captain?" "Yes," Carl replied. The officer studied him for a moment, then said, "You're lucky. Another half hour and we would have dropped another run of charges right here." Carl gave a faint, humorless smile.
then maybe it's the sea that spared us. The British sailors began helping the German crew out, one by one. Some men were too weak to climb. They were lifted up like ghosts. Others wept openly as they touched the open air, the sunlight, the wind. The destroyer crew offered water and blankets. In war, mercy was rare, but on that morning, mercy existed, quietly, without speeches or flags. As the last man was taken aboard the destroyer, Carl looked back at his U-boat, the steel beast that had carried them across oceans, now silent, half-flooded, leaning to one side. He reached out and touched the rusted hull. It was cold, like touching a corpse. Hans came up beside him. "We made it," he said softly. Carl nodded. "Yes, but part of us will always stay down there." The British officer called, "Captain, you're the last. Let's go."
Carl took one final look at his submarine, the only home he'd known for months. Every corner of it held a memory. Laughter over coffee before a mission, arguments over navigation charts, quiet moments when men confessed what they'd do if they ever made it home. Now, all of it was ending in silence. He whispered, "Rest easy, old friend," and stepped onto the rope ladder. As he climbed aboard HMS Hunter, the crew of U-327 stood in a line, shivering but alive. The British sailors kept their distance, unsure what to say. Enemies, yet also men who shared the same ocean, the same fear. One British seaman, maybe 19, looked at them and murmured, "Hell of a way to meet, huh?" Carl gave a tired nod. "Aye, but better this way than the other." The destroyer turned slowly, heading east toward the Allied base in Scotland. Behind them, the U-boat drifted, slowly sinking. The waves lapped over the deck, swallowing the last traces of war metal. The sea was claiming its debt. For hours, no one spoke. The German sailors sat quietly, wrapped in blankets, staring at the water. Some prayed, some just closed their eyes, letting the hum of the ship lull them into uneasy sleep. As dusk fell, Carl stood alone on the deck. The British officer approached him again. "You'll be questioned when we reach land, but off the record, what happened down there?" Carl looked out at the horizon, where the last bit of sunlight glowed red over the water. He said quietly, "We ran out of power, then air, then hope, but we didn't run out of men." The officer nodded slowly. "You're lucky, Captain. Most don't come back from that deep." Carl turned to him. "No one really comes back. The sea keeps something from everyone who goes down there." Night came, and with it, peace. The first true peace the crew had known in months. Hours later, as they approached land, Carl watched the faint glow of the coast appear. He felt both relief and sorrow. Survival was victory, but it also meant remembering every man who hadn't made it. When they finally docked, Allied soldiers stood waiting. The Germans disembarked silently, escorted but not mistreated. Each man looked at the ground, their boots scraping against the pier. Carl was the last to step off. He turned once more toward the sea. The wind carried the faint sound of waves breaking, like distant whispers. And he realized something. The sea wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind either. It simply was. Eternal, indifferent, and powerful. A reminder that no empire, no war, no nation could ever truly command it. As the guards led him away, Carl whispered to himself, "The sea forgets no one." And somewhere, far behind him,
deep below the rolling Atlantic, the wreck of U-327 settled into the dark, silent again, its lights long dead, but its story alive forever in the hearts of those who survived it.